My sister stood there smiling like she had just won the lottery. Dad handed her the keys and said, "You're going to do great things." Everyone clapped, cameras flashed. She hugged him like she deserved the whole world. Then Dad turned to me, holding a small box. "This one's for you." I already knew something was off. His smile wasn't proud, just expectant. I opened the box. Inside was a stack of cleaning supplies, sponges, gloves, a bottle of all-purpose cleaner. Dad nodded, almost satisfied. "It's time you help around the house more. You're good at it." My sister giggled under her breath. My brother didn't even try to hide his smirk. The room felt heavier than anything they put in my hands. I didn't say a word. I set the box on the table, grabbed my bag, and walked out of the house while the party kept going behind me. Not one person followed. I was halfway down the street when my phone rang. Mom. Her voice cracked through the speaker. "Where are you? Come back. Right now." I looked at the screen, my hand shaking, though not from fear anymore. "Pray," I said quietly. "You have 1 hour left." Then I hung up. My name is Morgan. I'm the oldest child in my family, and somehow I became the one expected to carry everyone else. But what happened at that party, that was the moment everything changed. And trust me, cleaning supplies were only the beginning. If you think that gift was bad, wait until you hear what happened after I walked out. This story gets much darker than anyone in my family expected. Long before that moment at the party, my life had been shaped by expectations I never agreed to. I didn't notice how heavy they were until I grew older, but the signs had been there for years, quiet, persistent, and impossible to ignore once I let myself look straight at them. When I think back to the house where I grew up, the first thing that comes to mind isn't warmth, or chaos, or noise. It's responsibility. It sat on my shoulders before I even understood what it meant. My parents didn't say it outright, but I became the person who covered every gap the moment it appeared. If something needed to be done, I felt it before anyone asked. If the day got messy, I stepped in without being told. And slowly, without noticing, I learned that stepping in was the only way to keep the peace. My sister Haley moved through the same house like she was meant for something brighter. Everything around her bent to make room for whatever she wanted next. She got the new clothes, the upgraded laptop, the after-school activities that required hours of driving. My parents talked about her future like it was a project the whole family was responsible for. I watched them rearrange schedules, finances, even conversations around the image they had built for her. It wasn't jealousy I felt. It was distance. A quiet confirmation that we were living two different versions of childhood under the same roof. My brother, Tyler, didn't feel the weight I carried either. He was younger, loud, carefree. No one expected him to notice the cracks in the family routine, so he didn't. When chores fell behind, they didn't look at him. When school calls came in, they handled them gently. He lived in a pocket of leniency that never seemed to run out. I didn't resent him for it, but I couldn't ignore how different our roles were. Dad, Kevin, spent long stretches on the road driving freight, and when he came home, he carried a tiredness that made him hard to approach. Mom, Brenda, worked part-time at an office nearby, and whatever energy she had left when she walked through the door was usually poured straight into Haley's next goal. Somewhere along the way, without anyone deciding it explicitly, I filled the leftover space. I learned to cook because someone had to. I handled laundry because it piled up. I kept the house running because letting it fall apart felt like failing at something I didn't sign up for, but couldn't walk away from either. My parents praised me for being mature, for being steady, for not needing much. They said it with pride, but underneath the praise was a message I couldn't ignore. They were relieved I didn't require the same investment as Haley. I was useful because I didn't ask for anything. I kept things together. I didn't push back. And little by little, I started believing that was the role I was meant to play. As I got older, that role only deepened. Haley's confidence grew with every opportunity laid out in front of her. Tyler floated along without pressure. And me? I became the structure they leaned on without ever questioning whether I had space to want something for myself. It took me years to realize the truth. What they called reliability was really convenience. What they celebrated as strength was simply my silence. The week leading up to my sister's graduation carried a pace that felt strangely familiar, yet heavier than usual, as if every small demand around the house had been quietly multiplied. I didn't question it at first. Tasks had always drifted toward me without much discussion, but there was something different about that particular stretch of days, an urgency I couldn't quite name, a sense that everyone else seemed to understand their purpose, while mine was simply assumed. Preparation started early. Each morning, I woke to the low hum of plans already in motion. My parents talked about schedules and errands, speaking with an energy I rarely saw directed at anything else in our home. Their excitement created its own rhythm, and somehow I fell into step with it even though nothing about the celebration was meant for me. I moved through the house, picking up whatever pieces had been left undone after their discussions. It didn't occur to anyone to ask whether I had time or energy. The expectation hung between us like an unwritten rule. Haley carried herself with a confidence that made the week feel even longer. Every moment she walked into a room, the atmosphere shifted toward her. My parents listened closely whenever she spoke, adjusting their plans to match her preferences as though nothing was more important. I watched their faces light up, and even though I had become used to that dynamic, something about watching it on display for such a big milestone made the distance between us stretch further than usual. Tyler drifted through the days without much awareness of how much work was unfolding around him. He seemed amused by the chaos, slipping in and out of conversations without committing to anything that resembled responsibility. I didn't blame him for it. He had learned early that he wasn't expected to do more than exist. Still, seeing him so untouched by the pressure building in the house reminded me of the imbalance I had grown too comfortable carrying. Errands piled up, and I took each one quietly because the alternative was letting them fall behind. I found myself navigating grocery aisles after work, making last-minute stops for decorations, and sorting through lists my parents rattled off without ever writing down. Their gratitude wasn't expressed. They weren't unkind, but their focus was fixed on something beyond me. I moved with the steady effort of someone who had done this for so long that the habit felt like part of my identity. Somewhere in the middle of the week, I noticed conversations in the house shift in tone. They weren't just planning the celebration anymore. They were planning something larger. I heard unfamiliar terms floating through rooms: insurance, payments, interest, things that didn't match the budget concerns I had known them to wrestle with before. My dad carried a seriousness in his voice that didn't usually accompany simple party planning. My mom sounded hopeful in a way that didn't belong to routine errands or grocery lists. The details didn't make sense to me yet, but I felt them pressing against the edges of my attention. Even with all the moving pieces, no one explained anything. The house buzzed with excitement I didn't share, but I kept working, filling gaps because I didn't know another way to function. Each day left me more aware of the unspoken roles in our family: who received, who requested, and who quietly ensured things ran the way everyone needed them to. I stayed in motion, trying to ignore the persistent feeling that something significant was being prepared just out of my line of sight, waiting for the moment when it would finally reveal itself. The morning of the graduation brought a pace I couldn't quite prepare myself for, even though I had watched the buildup unfold piece by piece. There was a sharp focus in the house that didn't include me, but I kept moving through it with the same steady rhythm I had carried all week. Something about that day felt tightened, as if every small detail was holding its breath, waiting for its moment to matter. I kept myself busy, partly out of habit and partly because standing still made the disconnect too noticeable. The house buzzed with a kind of anticipation that didn't belong to me, and yet I was the one picking up the excess. Straightening, sorting, making sure the plans my parents had so carefully layered wouldn't slip out of place. No one asked for my help. They didn't need to. The expectation sat beneath every gesture, silent but familiar. As the afternoon arrived, the mood in the house shifted in a way that tugged at my attention. My parents moved with a confidence that didn't match the financial strain I knew lingered beneath the surface. They carried themselves as though nothing was off balance, even though pieces of their earlier conversations still pressed at the edges of my thoughts. I didn't fully understand the weight behind their decisions, but I sensed the consequences forming long before they reached me. Haley prepared for her moment with an ease that made everything look effortless. She knew the day belonged to her, and she embraced it without hesitation. Watching her move reminded me of how certain she had always been that the world would open for her. It wasn't arrogance, just a kind of certainty she had grown up with, shaped by the attention that always flowed in her direction. I didn't resent her for it, but there was a sting in knowing how different our paths looked while standing only a few feet apart. Tyler approached the day like an observer drifting through a scene he didn't feel obligated to participate in. He carried no pressure, no expectations, no sense of responsibility for anything happening around him. It amazed me how easily he slipped through family events without being touched by their demands. He had learned early that he didn't need to anchor himself to anything. Someone else would pick up what he let fall. The hours crept forward, and the celebration finally reached the moment everyone had been waiting for. The house filled with a pride that didn't belong to me, but I felt it pressing in from every direction. I could feel the distance growing, not because anyone pushed me out, but because no one thought to pull me in. It was a pattern I had learned to live with, though the weight of it settled heavier on days meant to mark milestones. Then came the part I hadn't been prepared for, not because I didn't expect to be overlooked, but because the contrast was sharper than anything that had come before it. The gathering quieted, and I felt all eyes shift toward my parents. Their excitement carried a kind of boldness that made the room feel smaller. I watched the anticipation grow around Haley, and somewhere deep in my chest, something twisted. Not from jealousy, but from the unmistakable sense that this day would redraw the lines of our family in a way I couldn't undo. I stood still, waiting to see how far those lines would stretch, unaware that in a few minutes, everything I thought I understood about my place in that house would tilt sharply into something I couldn't unsee. The shift in the room settled into a heavy stillness as everyone waited for the moment that had clearly been rehearsed without me. I felt the weight of anticipation pressing from every corner, tightening around my chest in a way that made it hard to breathe. I didn't move, mostly because I didn't trust what my body might give away if I did. My parents stood with a certainty that made it obvious they had planned every part of what was about to unfold, and I could only watch as the focus of the celebration narrowed into something sharp. Haley stepped forward with the kind of ease that came from knowing she belonged at the center. I saw the glow of pride on my parents' faces, a brightness I recognized, but had never been on the receiving end of. They weren't trying to hide their excitement. It pulsed through every gesture, every glance exchanged between them. The air shifted again as they revealed the gift they had selected for her. And suddenly the energy around me surged into something overwhelming. I felt myself shrink inward as the impact of their choice settled across my skin. The moment stretched longer than I expected, long enough for me to grasp the full meaning behind what they had done. Their decision wasn't just generous, it was bold, almost reckless, carried out with a confidence that suggested they believed the future would bend itself around their hopes. I registered the reality of it slowly, piecing together the hints I had noticed in their voices earlier that week, and a quiet ache formed in my chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was the unmistakable clarity of knowing where I stood. When my turn arrived, the energy in the room shifted subtly, just enough for me to feel the contrast. The attention that had filled the space moments earlier faded into something thinner, something polite. I stepped forward because that was what was expected of me, but a hollow feeling spread through my stomach as I braced myself for whatever they had decided I deserved. The anticipation around me held none of the excitement that had surrounded Haley. Instead, it carried the muted expectation of a formality. The moment I saw the contents of the package they handed me, something deep inside me fractured. There was no mistaking the message behind their choice. It wasn't practical. It wasn't thoughtful. It was a reminder of the role I had been assigned without consent. I felt a tightening in my throat that made swallowing difficult. My chest burned with an emotion that didn't know whether to be anger, exhaustion, or disbelief. The weight of every unspoken expectation I had carried for years pressed in on me all at once. I stood there, holding the reality of their perception of me in my hands, and felt the room grow smaller with every second. My mind scrambled to find reasons, to justify, to excuse, to soften the blow, but the truth settled with a force I couldn't ignore. This wasn't an oversight. It wasn't an accident. It was the clearest expression of where I fit within the structure of our family, delivered without hesitation. A quiet numbness crept through me as I tried to steady my breathing. I couldn't speak, not because there was nothing to say, but because everything I felt was too sharp to shape into words. The distance between us, which I had spent years trying to ignore, finally revealed itself without disguise. And in that moment, standing there with that gift in my hands, I realized the lines within our family had been drawn long before this day. I had simply refused to look at them until now. Stepping outside that evening felt like crossing an invisible line I didn't know I had been walking toward for years. The air carried a weightless clarity that contrasted sharply with the heaviness that had settled on my chest inside the house. I didn't look back as I left, knowing that turning around would only pull me back into a role I no longer had the strength to carry. With every step, the distance between the life I had been living and the one I needed to build stretched wider, and something in me finally loosened. I moved on instinct, keeping my thoughts contained so they wouldn't spill over into panic. The shock of what had happened lingered like a dull ache, but beneath it was a quiet determination I didn't know I still possessed. Leaving wasn't an act of rebellion. It was survival. I understood that clearly now. If I stayed, I would keep shrinking myself until there was nothing left. The realization struck deeper than the sting of the gift I had been handed. It wasn't about the object. It was about years of being defined by responsibilities no one else had to shoulder. Reaching my apartment brought a sense of unfamiliar freedom that felt both comforting and unsettling. The space was small and quiet, yet it felt more mine than any room I had grown up in. I set my things down carefully, trying to steady my breathing as the rush of emotions pushed their way forward. For the first time in a long time, the silence wasn't a burden. It didn't expect anything from me. It didn't measure my worth by what I could accomplish for someone else. As the hours passed, the reality of what I had walked away from unfolded slowly in my mind. The years of doing more than I should have. The unspoken assumption that my needs could wait indefinitely. The subtle way my identity had been shaped around usefulness rather than individuality. I had learned to accept those patterns because breaking them felt impossible. Yet the moment I stepped outside, I realized the door wasn't locked. I had simply never tried to open it. I spent the next several days adjusting to a life that didn't revolve around others' expectations. The freedom was disorienting at first. I woke up without a list of tasks waiting for me, without the pressure of filling in the gaps left by everyone else. It was unfamiliar to prioritize myself, and some part of me felt guilty for it. But the more time I spent in that space, the more I understood how deeply I had needed this separation. I found a job that offered stability, something I could rely on while figuring out what came next. The work wasn't glamorous, but it belonged to me, and that was enough. Without the constant demands of my family weighing me down, I could put energy into building something sustainable. I started taking small steps, setting goals, learning new skills, saving what I could. The process was slow, but each day carried a quiet sense of progress I had never felt before. Even with the forward motion, the emotional distance wasn't easy. The absence of their voices left a gap I didn't want to admit existed. I wasn't immune to the pull of familiarity, even if it came from a place that never fully saw me. But I reminded myself that stepping away wasn't abandonment. It was an act of reclaiming the parts of myself I had buried under years of obligation. I was finally beginning to understand that my worth didn't depend on how useful I could be to others, and that realization changed everything. Time continued moving forward whether I was ready for it or not. The distance between my life and the one I had walked away from stretched a little more each week, becoming something I could feel in the quiet of my apartment. I built routines that steadied me, early mornings before work, late evenings spent learning skills I once thought belonged to other people. Life wasn't glamorous, but it was mine, and that ownership grounded me in a way I had never experienced growing up. The messages from home shifted as their situation worsened. What started as hints turned into fragments of urgency. They never said things directly, but the tone changed. Tension leaked through every line. I read each update with a strange detachment, the kind that comes from finally understanding a pattern you once felt trapped inside. I didn't answer, not because I wanted them to suffer, but because I had learned what stepping in would cost me. Loving people didn't mean allowing their choices to swallow me whole. As their problems escalated, so did their attempts to reach me. My phone lit up at odd hours, the notifications stacking until I silenced them entirely. I imagined the atmosphere inside the house, strained conversations, restless nights, the slow unraveling of plans built on denial. I could picture them realizing, piece by piece, that the safety net they had depended on for years was no longer within reach. It wasn't vindication. It was simply the reality of choices catching up to them. Haley's life shifted more abruptly than anyone else's. Without the car, her world shrank in ways she had never anticipated. She had to navigate schedules, responsibilities, and the discomfort of being accountable for her own movements. Tyler, too, saw the change. The ease he once moved through the house with faded as the weight of daily stress settled over everyone. For the first time, they were experiencing the pressure I had carried alone for so long. My parents adapted in the only ways they could. My dad added hours that pushed him past exhaustion, while my mom worked shifts she once viewed as beneath her. Their struggles were not unfamiliar. They were simply new to them. Watching from a distance, I understood how deeply they had relied on the version of me who never said no. That version no longer existed, and the space left behind forced them to confront the responsibilities they had passed to me for years. Meanwhile, I continued building a life that finally felt stable. I saved enough to quiet the constant fear of unexpected expenses. I learned how to trust my own judgment. I discovered what it felt like to be responsible only for myself. There were moments of grief, moments when I wished things could have been different, not for nostalgia, but for the possibility of a relationship that had never been given a chance to exist. Accepting that reality wasn't a sign of weakness. It was a step toward peace. In the end, I chose to remain apart. I didn't return for conversations that pretended nothing had happened. I didn't reopen doors that had taken me years to close. Walking away wasn't about proving a point. It was about choosing a future where my worth wasn't measured by how much burden I could carry. If there is anything I learned through all of this, It is that survival is not selfish. Boundaries are not betrayals, and distance can sometimes be the clearest expression of self-respect. Families can shape us, but they cannot define the limits of our dignity unless we let them. Breaking free from the weight I once believed I owed them allowed me to build a life that reflects who I am, not who they needed me to be.